Well, thanks very much, Jack, for the introduction. Thank you to the Queensland Media Club and to all of you who've joined us today, and to the organisers and sponsors, primarily the airport, Virgin, and also a special mention for Griffith University in its 50th birthday year, and also because Griffith educated 3 of the 4 Queensland frontbenchers in the Albanese Labor government. Now, one of them is Annika Wells, the newest member of our cabinet. She's joined us today. Thanks, Annika. Also here with Stephen Miles and Grace and Ali France, our wonderful candidate for Dixon as well. Now, together we all acknowledge the Yagara people and the Turrbal as well from across the Maiwa. I also wanted to make a point of thanking the SES, the first responders, the energy workers, everyone who has been there for our communities in recent days in difficult conditions. And I also wanted to acknowledge the working journalists here for the way that you have conveyed the necessary information about ex-tropical cyclone Alfred in a way that's helped people prepare and endure and respond to all of that heavy weather that accompanied it. From last week in southeast Queensland or northern New South Wales to last month up north, we've been tested again. And once more that test has revealed that unique and equal an enviable combination of compassion and irreverence, pragmatism and perspectives that we share as Australians. And as a Queenslander, I saw those qualities on display in my own community last week as well. And also alongside the Prime Minister, visiting the barracks and meeting volunteers in Brisbane and at the disaster management headquarters in Logan and on the Gold Coast as well. Now, how we fund recovery and rebuild communities is the first key influence on the budget that we'll hand down a week from today. The human impacts matter most to us here, but the economic costs will be very significant as well. At one stage, around 5 million Australians were in harm's way, and that put almost 2 million homes at risk. Days of heavy winds and soaking rain saw major flooding and substantial damage.
Australia cannot afford any more climate disasters, the intensity of those. When will the Labor Party stop funding for coal and gas projects? When will the Labor Party stop funding coal and gas projects? When will the Labor Party stop funding coal and gas projects? When will the Labor Party stop funding?
Now, at its worst, the heavy weather, the major flooding and the substantial damage meant that more than 450,000 Australians were cut off from power.
Young people of this nation are going to suffer for the rest of their lives. When is Labor going to stop funding and approving new coal and gas? We cannot say we're dealing with the disaster while you are funding the disaster.
More than 450,000 Australians were cut off from power, the most ever in this part of the country at once. Now, we're still getting a handle on the economic fallout, but the cost will be substantial. And the budget will book Treasury's best initial estimates, an immediate hit to GDP of up to $1.2 billion. And this could wipe 1/4 percentage point off quarterly economic growth. And with businesses temporarily shuttered, the economy shed about 12 million work hours. Could also lead to upward pressure on inflation, from building costs to damaged crops raising prices for staples like fruit and vegetables. As of yesterday, 63,600 insurance claims had been lodged, with early modelling suggesting losses covered by the reinsurance pool are around $1.7 billion. So we don't yet know the precise cost to our budget, but again, it will be significant. We've already co-sponsored with the states $30 million worth of support for immediate recovery costs, repairing roads and infrastructure and cleaning up parks and community centres. And millions of dollars of support are already flowing to people in the form of hardship payments and allowances, with more of that expected. Now, this budget will reflect some of those immediate costs and will make sensible provisions for more to come. I expect that these costs and these new provisions will be in the order of at least $1.2 billion, a substantial amount of money, and that means a big new pressure on the budget. At the mid-year update, we'd already booked $11.6 billion for disaster support nationally over the forward estimates. And with all of this extra funding, we now expect that to rise to at least $13.5 billion when accounting for our provisioning, our social security costs and other disaster-related support. And this will ensure that we are there for people and communities like they've been there for each other in the worst hit areas. Now, if the first major influence on this budget has been meteorological, the second has been global. This is a new world of uncertainty. The global economy is volatile and it's unpredictable. There's a new US administration disrupting trade. There's a slowdown in China. There's war in Eastern Europe and a very fragile ceasefire in the Middle East. Division and dissatisfaction around the world. We've seen extreme market volatility in the US and elsewhere as a consequence. The S&P fell 10% since mid-February, pulling other markets down with it as well. Now, even in the most benign scenario, global growth over the next 3 years is expected to be its weakest since the 1990s. Overnight, the OECD downgraded its growth expectations for next year and the year after. And Treasury forecasts in our budget will have Chinese and American growth slowing to around 4.5% and 2% next year, respectively. The forecasts for the US are the same as the mid-year update, but the downside risks are weighing much more heavily now. Unemployment is rising overseas from higher interest rates, and in the UK, inflation is actually going up again. This is the global backdrop for the budget. But amidst all of this churn and change, we've been very careful to make a distinction between the cyclical and the structural. And by that I mean the fluctuations that we need to manage in the short term versus the big transformations in the global economy that require a longer term response. And one of these transformations is the big shift from globalisation to fragmentation that we identified in our intergenerational report. It's clear now that the rules that underpinned global economic engagement for more than 40 years are being rewritten. The whole world has changed. We've seen that change accelerate since Inauguration Day in the US. Developments since then have not been surprising, but they have been seismic. And as a trading nation, Australia has a lot at stake. So the decision not to exempt Australia from American tariffs on steel and aluminium was disappointing, unnecessary, senseless and wrong, as the Prime Minister rightly pointed out at the time. We're not uniquely disadvantaged by these tariffs, but we deserve better as a long-term partner and ally. Our producers make amazing, sought-after, high-quality aluminium and steel, and they will diversify, but they shouldn't have to. Tariffs and escalating trade tensions are a form of economic self-harm. They are self-defeating and they are self-sabotaging. Because more trade restrictions means less growth and more inflation. The Productivity Commission made that point today in the media. And the impacts of what we're seeing will not be confined to one industry or one community or one quarter in our economy. These were two of the core conclusions of the OECD's Outlook report released overnight. Trade barriers are a key reason why its economists now expect slower growth. And they think inflation will linger for longer across the globe. The risk of recession in the world's largest economy is rising as well. And all of this has consequences for us. Treasury modelled the impact of tariffs on our economy, and they did this before the US election, and they did it again after the inauguration of President Trump. Treasury estimates that the direct hit to GDP from steel and aluminium tariffs would be less than 0.02% by 2030. So the direct overall impacts on Australia should be manageable. But when you add in the indirect effects, the hit to GDP could be more like 0.1% by 2030. In fact, over a whole range of scenarios, Treasury found the indirect GDP impacts of a trade war could be up to 4 times larger than the direct impacts of tariffs on our own economy. So in a world of retaliation and escalation, the impacts of tariffs are amplified. They linger for longer, resulting in a bigger reduction in GDP and bigger increases in prices. Now, our response as the Australian government will not be a race to the bottom on tariffs. We will go for more resilience, not for more retaliation, because more and higher tariffs will harm, not help, our workers, our businesses, our industries and our economy. Now, against this uncertain backdrop, the progress that we've made together in our economy is even more exceptional and even more important. The encouraging performance of our economy is the third major impact and influence on the budget. Because despite everything that's coming at us from off the East Coast and from right around the world, And after 3 very difficult years, the Australian economy has turned a corner. We saw that in the most recent national accounts, which showed growth in our economy rebounding solidly, and with bigger contributions from households and new business investment, which means that the private sector is making a more substantial, more promising contribution to GDP growth. At the same time, real wages and living standards are growing again, supported by our tax cuts and the interest rate cut, and sentiment has been zigzagging up overall as a consequence. Now, these are all early and encouraging signs that momentum in our economy is building. We know people are still doing it tough, and that's why our cost of living relief and cost of living remains the major focus of our government. But consider for a moment what Australians have achieved together in our economy. Inflation, a third of its peak, and now in the lower half of the target band. The lowest average unemployment rate for any government in 50 years. Stronger employment growth than any major advanced economy. 4 in every 5 of the 1.1 million jobs created this term in the private sector. More jobs created in the market sector than any first-term government on record. Record labour force participation. The strongest rate of real wage growth since 2020, and now 5 consecutive quarters of annual real wage growth. The gender pay gap at record lows. Unemployment around 4% and inflation below 3% at the same time for the first time in half a century. The highest level of business investment in over a decade in the last financial year. 25,000 new businesses created each month this term, the highest average on record. 30 share market record highs since the election. 25% growth in household wealth via super and shares as a result. The first back-to-back surpluses in almost 2 decades. The biggest nominal improvement in the budget in a parliamentary term ever. An overall budget position $200 billion better off than what we inherited. More than $90 billion of savings, with more to come. Real spending growth, about a third of what our predecessors averaged. And spending as a share of the economy down from almost a third to closer to a quarter. And because of our efforts, debt is down by more than $170 billion this year, which means billions of dollars of savings in interest costs. Remembering interest is one of the 6 biggest spending pressures in our budget. So this means that the surpluses in the first 2 years and a much smaller deficit this year compared to what we inherited are also making a structural difference to the budget, as do the structural changes we've made to the NDIS and aged care to ensure spending is more sustainable. I give Annika a lot of credit for that. So we're making meaningful progress on 3 of the 6 biggest pressures in our budget, while spending on the other 3, health, early childhood education and defence, is growing in warranted ways. Now, every Australian has played a part in the progress that we are making in our economy. That progress is even more remarkable when you remember what we inherited when we came to office. Inflation was higher and rising, interest rates already going up, living standards and real wages were going backwards, the worst productivity growth in more than half a century, a decade of deficits and not enough to show for $1 trillion in Liberal debt. Now, because of all of our efforts, inflation is down, incomes are strengthening, unemployment is very low, interest rates are coming down, debt is down and growth is picking up. Now, this is a remarkable combination and it's also exceptional. Exceptional when you look around the world and exceptional when you look back through history. Unique among comparable countries, unprecedented in Australia and defying the economic orthodoxy. We've got inflation down without paying for that progress with mass job losses or negative growth. And we've seen the opposite overseas. Take New Zealand. Inflation has fallen from its peak here just as quickly as it has across the Tasman. But there are 2 key differences. New Zealand's currently in recession and its unemployment rate is above 5%. In the UK, inflation has also come down at a similar rate to us. But there it's now ticking back up. And they had a recession earlier on, and unemployment is rising. It's already in the mid-4s. Now, the last 3 times that Australia has come down from an inflation spike, unemployment rose significantly and growth went badly backwards. In the mid-70s, unemployment increased by a staggering 50%, and the economy went into recession. In the 80s and 90s, the unemployment rate doubled to more than 10%, and there were also deep recessions. If our unemployment rate had risen by that much, almost 900,000 more Australians would be unemployed right now. Now, our progress together has been deliberate, not accidental. It's the dividend of the economic strategy that we have been pursuing now for 3 years, and it's been guided by 3 principles: relief, repair and reform. Providing cost of living relief in a meaningful but responsible way, repairing the budget and reforming our economy, making sure every taxpayer got a tax cut, not just some, delivering responsible cost of living relief that's taken some of the edge off energy, health and rent costs, maintaining a primary focus on the fight against inflation without ignoring the risks to growth, and repairing the budget at the same time. Now, we said from the outset that we'd rather a soft landing in our economy than to have to clean up after a hard one. And thanks to that strategy, a soft landing is looking more and more likely. So this is the foundation and the momentum that we will build our budget on. It'll be a responsible budget which helps with the cost of living, builds our future, and makes our economy more resilient in this new world of global uncertainty. Our economic plan is working, but we know that there is much more work to do. And so the budget will flesh out and advance our plan for prosperity. And there will be 5 major priorities. Firstly, supporting the recovery and rebuilding from Cyclone Alfred, including the $1.2 billion provision that I've announced this week. Helping with the cost of living, finishing the fight against inflation and rebuilding living standards. That's the second priority. Thirdly, strengthening Medicare and funding more urgent care clinics. Then investing in every stage of education. And finally, making our economy more competitive, dynamic and productive as the foundation of a new generation of prosperity. Now, most of the big initiatives under these headings have already been announced. The $8.5 billion investment in strengthening Medicare is a cost of living policy with economic benefits, because more bulk billing and more GPs means less pressure on families. Same goes for the $644 million in new urgent care clinics and more than $500 million for women's health. Multi-billion dollar investments in Whyalla, in iron, aluminium and in our Future Made in Australia agenda will support jobs and industry, as will funding our Buy Australia campaign. Another $7.2 billion for the Bruce Highway here in Queensland, $2 billion to transform Sunshine Station in Victoria, and $1 billion for new rail links in Western Sydney will connect people and communities and economies faster, more efficiently and more safely. Our 3-day guarantee for early childhood education and broader investments in every stage of education will help workforce participation and boost human capital. Slashing $19 billion in debt for 3 million Australians and lifting the compulsory repayment threshold will ease cost of living pressures for students and graduates. And policies to improve competition in aviation, secure banking services in our regions, revitalise national competition policy and finish the NBN will all strengthen our economy. Now, this is more than we typically unveil before the budget, and there will be provisions in the budget for policies that we will announce in the campaign, not next week. All of this means that there will be fewer surprises this time round on budget night. Already some of the speculation has been way off. For example, some commentators have made wild and wide of the mark predictions about huge surges in revenue. Some wrongly predict that the tax to GDP ratio will go up this year when Treasury expects it to be stable or even a bit down. Revenue upgrades have actually come off very significantly since the highs of 2022. Treasury doesn't expect the bottom line this year or over the forward estimates to change very substantially from the mid-year economic update. And we need to remember here that revenue upgrades are the exception rather than the norm. Over the past 25 budget updates, upgrades have occurred in less than half of them and in only around 1 in 5 budget updates before the pandemic. What you'll likely see in the budget next week is that Treasury expects any upgrade to be about 1/6 of the average of our budget updates, the smallest revenue upgrade of the 4 budgets so far by far. This is largely due to commodity prices and volumes dipping and also our labour market normalising. So this will constrain our choices and put an even bigger premium on what's responsible and affordable and achievable. Now, I'm conscious of time, and I hope that you've noticed I've largely focused today on the economics rather than on the politics. I've always believed that if you get the economics right, the politics will sort themselves out. But I know some of the questions from the media will be political, and so let me briefly set the scene with 3 quick points. The first point, only one side in this election contest has put a coherent economic plan out there. I've given you a sense of ours today, and the budget will flesh it out further. Our opponents have had 3 years and they still haven't come clean on a single costed, credible or coherent economic policy. And every time they try, it falls in a heap. We saw that with migration, nuclear, tax breaks for long lunches, work from home, and all of the comical contortions they put themselves through over insurance. We saw that in their militant and mindless opposition to everything we've tried to do to help people with the cost of living. We see it in their secret costs and hundreds of billions of dollars in secret cuts that the opposition leader has said Australians won't find out about until after the election. We saw this in 2014 with his surprise GP tax to undermine universal Medicare when he was the health minister. The second related point is that this poses an unacceptable risk to living standards and to the progress that we are making together. Our opponents seek to dismiss and diminish this progress, and they would derail and dismantle it if they win the election, taking us back to the rorts and wage stagnation and missed opportunities and warped priorities which defined their wasted decade in government. They have to find $600 billion to build their nuclear reactors, and those nuclear reactors will jack up power prices and slow growth. Now, these savings can only come from stripping funding out of Medicare again, or coming after pensions and payments again, or cutting housing, education, wages and essential services. And so they need to come clean on their secret cuts before the election, not after it. Now, if we'd taken their advice over the course of the last couple of years, Australia would have already gone into recession. And if they'd had their way on tax and wages and energy rebates, Australians would be thousands of dollars worse off already, and they would be worse off still if the coalition wins office. And so the third political point is a really simple one. It's that these issues and these differences will be absolutely front and centre in this election, because there could not be a worse time to put the progress that we are making together at risk by doubling back to Peter Dutton. It will be an election on the economy, and that is exactly what we want. Now, that's another reason to welcome the chance to hand down a budget next week. It's a welcome opportunity, and it's also a rare one, because for the first time since Chifley, more than 3/4 of a century ago, there'll be 4 budgets in one parliamentary term. So it's rare, but it's also welcome. And it's welcome because it puts the economy front and centre on the eve of an election, and it brings all of our policies, our plans and our progress together into one place. This budget, like the first 3, will be another big collective effort, drawing on the talents of our whole team, from the Prime Minister, his Cabinet, our caucus, public service and our staff, and of course the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher. And I left it until last to mention Katie because it's Katie's birthday today, and that warrants a special mention, but I promised her I wouldn't sing. Now, the uncertainty that all of us see is an unwelcome new normal in the global economy. We can't wish it away or hide and hope that it passes us by. When the storm's raging, the urgent and important thing to do is to fill sandbags and to help each other through. But we're also thinking about what comes next, how we go beyond building temporary defences and create permanent, lasting structures. Now, we'll do that in Australia by investing in our competitive advantages, by looking for opportunities to join with our partners in new, more resilient supply chains, by becoming an indispensable part of the net zero economy, and by preparing our people to adjust to and succeed in this new world of churn and change. This is a key motivation for our economic agenda, and it's central to this budget as well. And it struck me during the heavy weather, and what strikes me now, and what joins the experience of recent weeks with what we've seen in the national economy, is really that story about Australian exceptionalism. in uncertain, often unpredictable times. And for us, that's our platform for the progress and the prosperity to come. And that's what I've sought to flesh out for you today. The best sense of our fourth budget can still be found in the first three. All were defined by responsible economic management. Responsible in the specific sense of making it add up, but responsibility in a broader sense as well. Our responsibility to Australians cleaning up and rebuilding. Our responsibility to help people under pressure. Our responsibility to build another generation of progress and prosperity and share it with the people who do the hard yards. And our intergenerational responsibility to ensure our people are beneficiaries, not victims, of all of this churn and change in the world. Now, we accept this responsibility and we embrace this opportunity to build the kind of a future that Australians need and deserve, and the budget is going to be a really important part of that plan. Thank you, and I look forward to taking some questions.
Treasurer, thank you very much for that address. We'll now turn to the question and answer segment of today's event, and we'll turn to the press gallery very soon. But Treasurer, I just want to ask you, obviously this budget is being delivered with an election around the corner. You cited some statistics there in your speech, and you're certainly making the case that the economy is rebounding. But do you really think people feel better off now compared to 3 years ago when the Albanese government came to power?
Well, first of all, there's no question that the Australian economy has turned the corner. We see that in all of the ways I ran through in the speech. But what I've always done, and what I've done again today, is to acknowledge that a lot of people are still doing it tough. We know that there's not always a direct correlation between the progress we're making in the national aggregate data and how people are feeling and faring in the economy. And that's where our cost of living help is so important. The cost of living help that we're rolling out in all of those different ways. Tax cuts for every taxpayer, energy bill relief for every household, cheaper early childhood education, cheaper medicines, fee-free trade, rent assistance, getting wages moving again, getting inflation down. All of this is about not just recognising that people are under pressure, but actually doing something about it. And again, that comes to the core of the contest in this election year. You know, both the major parties in the parliament acknowledge that people are under pressure, but only our side of the parliament has been prepared to do anything about it. And our political opponents at every turn tried to prevent people from getting those tax cuts and getting that cost of living help. And because of that, Australians will be thousands of dollars worse off if Peter Dutton had his way on the cost of living help and on the tax cuts and on wages. And I think, as Angus Taylor rightly pointed out the other day, when he said that the best predictor of future performance is past performance, that should send a shiver up the spine of every Australian, because the past performance of the Liberal and National parties under Peter Dutton come after Medicare, come after wages and vote against cost of living help.
You talk to voters though. Do you think they feel better when you speak to them?
Well, I think I said in response to your first question, Jack, I acknowledge that when the national economic data in aggregate is turning Australia's way, and it has been in very encouraging, very welcome ways, that doesn't always immediately translate to how people are feeling or faring in the economy. I think I've acknowledged that throughout, certainly today on multiple occasions. And what really matters once you acknowledge that cost of living pressure is to be prepared to do something about it. That's why our cost of living help is so important. It's been meaningful, it's been substantial, it's been responsible, and without it, Australians would have been worse off, and that's what Peter Dutton wanted.
Okay, Treasurer, thank you. We'll now go to the back of the room, and I believe Tim Arvia from Channel 9 has the first question.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Treasurer, and thank you for your kind words about the Media Club earlier. Can I respond by saying here on table 21, we wish you all the best with delivering the budget, because as journalists we empathise with people given sudden and unexpected deadlines. My question though is about the Olympics. The federal government's
I knew your question was going to be about the Olympics.
How did you guess? Well, the federal government's committed $2.5 billion for the Brisbane Live Arena.
Yep.
Will you reconsider that if the Christopherly government tries to move the location of Brisbane Live Arena? And will you rule out any further funding in the budget or down the line for the Olympics?
Well, first of all, unless something's happened this morning, my understanding is we haven't been asked to reconsider the commitment that we've made to the arena. I work really closely with Annika, with Catherine King, with Anthony Chisholm, with the whole cabinet, the whole ministry, to find billions of dollars to contribute to the Olympics, because we think the Olympics are going to be amazing for this part of Australia and for Australia more broadly. So we're very enthusiastically investing, not just the 2.5 big ones for the arena, but also almost another $1 billion for the small venues too. And that shows a willingness and an enthusiasm on our part to invest in the Olympics. Now, I know that there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of conjecture around what the next steps might be when it comes to the review and the decisions that the state government may or not make. I see no point really engaging in those kinds of hypotheticals. I see that you report on this very frequently on my TV, and I don't doubt your sources or your intentions, but what we'll do is we'll see what the state government comes out with. Our preference, our intention is to stick to that $3.5 billion that we are providing to the Olympics, and as far as I know, we haven't been asked to do anything different.
So that decision about that funding, you'll make that when you see the plans coming out, is that correct?
Well, it strikes me as a hypothetical that, we see obviously daily reporting, yourself and others, about what may or may not be decided by the state government following the review when they release it. What we do is we work closely with state governments right around Australia, both political persuasions. We know that there's a big opportunity to make these Olympics amazing. We're contributing billions of dollars to that end, and we haven't been asked to consider any different kinds of plans.
Yeah. So, sorry, just to...
If and when that happens, we'll consider it.
Myself and Sarah Ellis here from The Australian have both reported there's a proposal from the review board to move Brisbane Live to the GoPro site at the Gabba. If that happens, will you reconsider your funding?
I think, as I've tried to say probably half a dozen ways now, Tim, I've seen your reports. I don't doubt your professionalism or your journalism or Sarah's. That would be mad to do that, especially here. But we haven't been approached about any different plans from the state government. We'll consider that if and when it happens.
And just very quickly to finish, have you been approached by the state government for any further funding? Have they asked you for any more money?
I haven't.
Thank you.
All right, who's next?
G'day, Jack. Treasurer Harry Clark from Sky News. I'm interested to hear a bit more of a breakdown of that $1.2 billion in federal money to recover from Cyclone Alfred. There were a lot of high winds. There was nowhere near the rain that was forecast. There was a lot of erosion on the Gold Coast, and some trees were shredded and some landed on some buildings. But we didn't see suburbs underwater, and there were no prevailing reports of crops being flattened. Unlike up in North Queensland with that big dump of rain, they just had the Bruce Highway Bridge got washed away. Where's that $1.2 billion being spent, and how does that figure compare to what you're putting into the recovery in North Queensland?
Yeah, thanks, Harry. First of all, we're still assessing the damage, but I can't wait for another 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or a couple of months before I put it in the budget. I've got to put a number in the budget a week from today, and so we make a sensible provision for the recovery and rebuilding communities. It's a combination of the hardship payments and the allowance in the social security system with the asks that we get from the state governments and local governments to rebuild local infrastructure. You'd be aware, you covered it, as I suspect most of you did on those tables up the back. You know that there's a whole range of different ways that the Commonwealth and the states work together to rebuild communities. Some of it's automatic, some of it comes from priority lists provided by the states. And so we've made our best estimate that we can at this point to provision responsibly for those sorts of costs. Now, this isn't the first time we've done it. As your question rightly alludes to the fact that we've also had the provision for a number of natural disasters in recent times, including what we saw in North Queensland and far North Queensland not that long ago. And so there's about $13.5 billion now provisioned in the budget over the forward estimates for these kinds of purposes. Now, if you'll forgive me one more point about the contrast at the election. Now, you will hear my opposite number, and occasionally the Leader of the Opposition sometimes talk about wasteful spending, and they use a big number. And the big number that they use includes the money that we have provisioned for natural disasters. They think natural disaster funding, billions of dollars we're providing in Queensland, New South Wales and elsewhere, is wasteful spending. We take a different view. We will be there for Australians as they rebuild. I understand that your question was based on we didn't get the worst case scenario, but we still got a lot of substantial damage. We still had people without power for a long time. We've had damage to local infrastructure. The damage to our farmers and our producers is still being assessed. And so we've made a sensible provision because of all of that.
Hello, Treasurer. Sarah Elks from the Australian newspaper.
You've got to quote Tim in your question because he quoted you in his.
I agree with him about sudden and unpredictable deadlines.
Right.
They're the bane of every Treasurer and journalist's existence. I wanted to ask about the Albanese government's previous promise about bringing electricity prices down from 2022 levels. Unfortunately, that did not occur. Can you now make a guarantee that power prices for consumers will come down or will at least remain stable in a second term of an Albanese Labor government?
Well, a couple of things about that, a couple of important points, Sarah, and I appreciate the question. First of all, if you look at the inflation numbers for the last year to the end of 2024, what we saw that electricity prices were down a little over 25%. And lest you want to think that that is all the rebate, most of that is the rebate, but they still would have gone down a bit over 1.5% absent the rebate. And so in the last year, what we saw was some pretty encouraging outcomes when it came to electricity prices. When it comes to the rebate, I want to shout out Stephen and Grace as well for the way that we worked together to take some of the edge off electricity bills. We understood that that was a big part of cost of living pressures. We worked together very effectively in ways that I'm very grateful for to take some of the edge off those electricity prices. Now we know, as I suspect your question is referring to, we've had the default market offer released in recent days, and in some parts of Australia we are expecting some price pressures. And as the experts, the independent experts said at the time, that is primarily about the unreliability of the legacy parts of the energy network. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that we are introducing cheaper, cleaner, more reliable energy into the system over time, because that's the only way over the longer term that you get that downward pressure on prices. Third point I'd make is that if you want lower electricity prices, the dumbest thing that you would do would be commit to nuclear reactors in 15 or 20 years' time, because that leaves the old unreliable parts of the system in place for longer. It's the most expensive form of new energy, and it will push up electricity prices as well as introduce a whole bunch of uncertainty. Now, to finish on the point you made about the 2022 levels, which I suspect is why you've asked for the microphone back. The number that you're referring to, which we all used on a number of occasions, was a forecast in 2021 about an outcome in 2025. And I think for a lot of the reasons that I've run through in my speech today, but also particular to the energy market, there's been a lot of uncertainty, a lot of volatility between 2021 and 2025. And so our responsibility is to first of all understand and accept electricity prices are a big part of the pressure on families, on households, on pensions, to do what we can in the near term, which we have with our energy rebates, and in the longer term with our cleaner and cheaper, more reliable energy. And in that, I'd happily stack up our plan against this nuclear insanity any day.
And just a follow-up, well foreshadowed, given that decision from the AER last week or this week that power prices or the price cap is due to rise, it sounds like you're not keen to make another guarantee in the way that you did in the past. Will there be further electricity bill relief for consumers in the budget next Tuesday? You can just give us a little hint. We won't tell anyone.
Well, I think as I've made pretty clear on a number of occasions now, there are hints in the first three budgets for the government's fourth budget. I'm obviously not going to commit to another round of energy bill rebates here with you in Brisbane a week out from the budget. But what I can say is that there'll be more cost of living help in the budget. The form of that will be made clear to you over the course of the next week or so. because we understand that people are still under pressure despite this quite remarkable progress that we're making together in our economy. And so there'll be cost of living help. It will be meaningful and substantial, and it will be responsible. It will be affordable. We can't do everything that we would like to do because of the fiscal and other constraints that we have. And there's always a premium on responsibility, but especially now. But there'll be cost of living help. The form of that, you have to tune in a week from now.
You won't guarantee power rebates in the next budget just yet?
I'm not going to do that today, Jack, and I'll give you the same answer I just gave Sarah. There'll be cost of living help in the budget. The form of that will be made clear to people over the course of the next week.
Would you like the states, you just spoke about that $1,000 rebate earlier, would you like the states to do more heavy lifting on that front and put more rebates in their budget?
Look, I don't give the states free advice about the pressures on their budgets or what they might do. I think what I've tried to do, in couching it in the positive, I'm a positive fella, is to acknowledge what Stephen and Grace did in the former cabinet here in Queensland. And I got asked from time to time to have a shot at these guys about the spending in their budget, and I refuse to do that because I think Australians need and deserve help with the cost of living. I think it's all hands on deck when it comes to that important task. We've been prepared to play our part. Stephen and the colleagues were prepared to play their part, and that's because we recognise people are under pressure. Now, there are limits to that. There are fiscal limits to that. We want to make sure that we're part of the solution when it comes to inflation, not part of the problem, and we've demonstrated an ability to do that. I'll leave the decisions for the state colleagues that they will make around their own cabinet tables.
Treasurer, Chris Burns from the Courier Mail, and this is really on the back of Tim's question. I feel we need to go back to the Olympics here. You've made your position very clear about the amount of funding the government's willing to put up. However, that obviously we're up in the air waiting for review findings to come out. Would you consider putting more funding in if it was used for generational infrastructure? And the second part of that question is it makes it very hard to give an informed answer to that. Why haven't you been able to see the GECA reviews reports yet?
What was the last part of your question again, please, mate?
Suppose let me rephrase that properly.
Thank you.
Why hasn't the state government briefed you on the findings of the Game Authority's final report?
Well, it's a question for them. I don't know the answer to that. Annika might have a deeper insight into that, or Catherine. We'll wait for the government to engage us. We've indicated a willingness and enthusiasm to work closely, the former government and the current government, to deliver an amazing Olympics. When it comes to the first part of your question, the $3.5 billion that we've put on the table, it's hard to find $3.5 billion. There's not a lot of spare cash lying around, and we found $3.5 billion, and we did that because the infrastructure that we want to build is generational. It is legacy infrastructure. We don't want to see a dollar of that $3.5 go to anything that doesn't make a lasting contribution to South East Queensland and the Australian community more broadly. And so we put a lot of work into that commitment. We didn't just pull that number out of a hat. We did a heap of work. We discussed it a bunch of times around the table at the Expenditure Review Committee and the Cabinet. Again, Annika and Catherine have done most of the work on this, with me playing a supportive role. But that's because we believe in these investments. We believe there'll be a generational dividend to them.
Would you like to see that review soon? They've been sitting on it for a while now.
Oh, ideally. I think we've made it really clear. If the state government is contemplating a change in direction, it would be good if they made that clear. We've not been approached to change the way that we're going at it. We've put $3.5 billion on the table for good reasons. We're big believers in the Olympics. We think it's going to be amazing, and we want to get cracking.
Can I just on a follow on from that though? You say you didn't pull that $3.5 billion out of a hat. How then are you going to take into account inflation, construction costs, given the fact that the Olympics are years away? Wouldn't you then account for more money along the way?
Yeah, that's a pretty common feature of budgeting for big infrastructure projects. And one of the reasons why there's a lot of pressure on our budgets collectively is because we have seen a blowout in costs. We try to provision for that and allow for that as responsibly as we can, but that's not unique to Olympics infrastructure. A lot of the projects we're building which have long lead times and long build times, we've unfortunately seen a blowout in costs, and so we try to adapt to that. We try to make room for that and provision for that in our budgets, and that's the case with the Olympics infrastructure too.
Hi, Treasurer. Joe Hinchcliffe from The Guardian. We're looking at a forecast of a string of deficits as far as the eye can see. With all due respect, how can you prosecute the argument that the Albanese government is a responsible economic manager?
We delivered the first two surpluses in almost 2 decades. Our predecessors promised a surplus in their first year and every year thereafter and went precisely none for 9. We have helped engineer a $200 billion turnaround in the budget, a $200 billion improvement in the budget. In nominal terms, that's the biggest that has ever happened. Even this year, where we will be printing next week a deficit, that deficit is very substantially smaller than what we inherited when we came to office. And we've been able to do all of that, to make all of that progress in the budget, at the same time as we provided this cost of living help, invested in the future, invested in the resilience of our economy. And one of the dividends of that, we don't see those two surpluses or the smaller deficits as an end in themselves. We see it as a way to avoid interest costs. We see it as a way to make room for other priorities so that we can fund cost of living help or natural disaster recovery and the like. But we've paid down, I think, more than $170 billion in Liberal debt since we came to office. We've only been here not even a full term yet. And that's saving us tens of billions of dollars in debt interest, which we can invest in strengthening Medicare or providing cost of living help and the like. And so I think any objective observer of the progress we've made in the budget over the last couple of years would recognise and would acknowledge, would concede that the way that we've managed the budget over the course of the last couple of years has been very responsible. Responsible in comparison with our predecessors, but responsible in terms of the overall progress that we've been able to make.
Treasurer, on the back of Harry's question before, just touching on heavy storms up north, obviously Queensland's faced 2 disasters recently, but in the Townsville region there are still residents in suburbs impacted by the heavy flooding, loss of clothes, furniture, who do not qualify for Commonwealth funding. What would you say to claims by a Coalition MP that there is a double standard between how the government responded to Tropical Cyclone Alfred compared to funding arrangements for the Townsville region? Is this an example or a case of the southeast being preferred to the regions?
No, I don't believe so. We've provided and we are providing very substantial assistance in funding in North Queensland and far North Queensland. We understand the very serious damage that's been done up north, and we consider the questions around eligibility, the questions around support, the questions about recovery funding and rebuilding communities to be the same whether they happen in Cairns or Townsville or Brisbane or the Gold Coast or in the Northern Rivers in New South Wales. And if there are instances where that support should have been provided and hasn't, obviously I'm prepared to take that up with the relevant colleagues.
Any more?
Yes, another one here. Mr. Treasurer, you've spoken about the global picture and talking about tariffs from the US on aluminium and steel and some of the comments you've made on them. Given those tariffs, what value does the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement still hold, and are you preparing, and how are you preparing for the prospect of future tariffs, perhaps in agriculture and other sectors?
Well, first of all, our colleague Don Farrell, the Trade Minister, has been engaging with his counterpart, I think, this morning on some of these important questions. Obviously, they've got, there is more discussion to be had between now and the next deadline, and we will make Australia's case. And a really important part of Australia's case is the fact that the US enjoys tariff-free access to our markets because of that free trade agreement. When I engage with my counterpart, when Don does, Penny does, Richard does, the PM does and others, one of the things that we point out is that this has been for a very long time a relationship of mutual economic benefit, and the free trade agreement has been part of that. The Americans run a big trade surplus with us. They enjoy tariff-free access to our markets. We have a substantial amount of the critical minerals that they're after. They build the future of their own economy, and so we've got a compelling story to tell, and we've got a good case to make when it comes to these tariffs. And as I've said today, the PM said the other day, and other colleagues have said in between, very disappointing decision from the US not to exempt us on steel and aluminium. The wrong decision, wrong-headed, for all of the reasons that we have made clear. And we will continue to engage between now and the next deadline and after that as well to make sure that we get the best deal that we can for our workers, our businesses, our industries and our economy.
We've got time for a couple more. Any more on the back table there?
Treasurer, the former Queensland government knew that their hiked coal royalties regime would most likely have an impact on GST and the GST share that Queensland would get. Should they have had a contingency plan in place for this redistribution that we've seen announced this week?
Well, first of all, everybody knows that royalty collection has an impact on the calculation made independently and at arm's length by the Commonwealth Grants Commission. I mean, that's not some kind of revelation. That's how the system works. What happens is the Commonwealth Grants Commission, at arm's length from the federal government for good reason, independent from the government, undertakes about 12 months worth of consultation with the states and territories. They do multiple rounds of that consultation. And people know that when other sources of income go up substantially, then that has implications for the formula. I think everybody has known that for some time. Now, the current Queensland government were clearly expecting that reduction because they booked a big part of it in their mid-year update. And they said at the time that they thought that there were further downside risks to that. And part of the reason for that is because in the relevant period, coal royalties went up, I think, $8.8 billion from memory. So none of that is a surprise. And again, I say the same thing I said yesterday when asked about this. It's not unusual for state treasurers and state governments to want more money from the Commonwealth or from the GST carve-up. That is, states wanting more money from the Commonwealth is a story as old as Federation. I continue to deal with Treasurer Janetsky and his colleagues in a respectful way. I understand they've got a view about this, but it's an independent process at arm's length, and it takes into consideration all of the things it's been taking into consideration for some time, including royalty payments in areas like coal.
We've got time for one more question. No?
I do have only, if none might. We had a few unexpected guests earlier today, and they were asking you when will Labor stop approving new coal and gas projects. You want to win a couple of seats from the Greens in Brisbane, Griffith and Brisbane. When will Labor stop approving new coal and gas projects?
Well, I don't think it's a good idea to reward that kind of behaviour by asking their questions for them. That's the first point.
It's still a relevant policy question. Yeah. It's not like those people were the first people to ask you that question.
No, I understand. What we have done and what we will continue to do is to make the best decisions that we can for our environment and for our economy, making sure that we balance all of the relevant considerations, environmental considerations, impact on communities, impact on the national economy. And what we have shown, and here I tip my lid to Tanya Plibersek and the colleagues, they have been approving heaps of renewable energy projects. I think a record amount of renewable energy projects from memory. And so what we're trying to do is to strike the right balance, recognising that we can make ourselves an indispensable part of the global net zero economy at the same time as we leverage some of our traditional strengths. There is a role, for example, for gas in the energy transformation. We've been upfront about that as well. So we'll continue to strike the right balance. I know that there's a range of views at one end and at the other end. We are a responsible, middle-of-the-road government which takes decisions based on evidence. We approve projects where we can, where they satisfy all of those criteria that I went through.
Treasurer, I'll just finish off with this one. Federal Labor has gone backwards in terms of the number of seats it holds in Queensland in the last 2 elections. Do you think Federal Labor would do better if it had a leader from Queensland?
Well, I think that's a bit embarrassing to put Annika on the spot like that. No, I think we're going to put our best foot forward in Queensland. And one of the reasons for that is because I genuinely believe that Anthony Albanese has that kind of practical pragmatism that Queenslanders appreciate. You know, Queenslanders are practical people, they're pragmatic, they're problem solvers, they're middle of the road, they're not especially ideological. And I think that's a description that applies equally to the Prime Minister. And I also, given you've given me this opportunity, the Prime Minister really enthusiastically believes in the future of our state. He believes in its contribution to the national economy and the nation more broadly. And one of the ways that he has demonstrated that commitment to us is the way that he has promoted and given positions of influence to Queenslanders. In our government, we've got 4 frontbenchers. You mentioned unkindly that our numbers were not exactly thick on the ground here in Queensland. But of the people that have been elected from Queensland into the Albanese government, you know, we've got 3 ministers in the cabinet, we've got another minister, we've got the Speaker of the House, we've got a couple of great backbenchers, we've got an envoy in Nita Green. And so we're short on numbers, but we're not short of influence. And when the time comes for the election campaign and when people are we're asking for Queenslanders for their vote, I think that they can rest assured that Queensland has a big say in our government, a big say in our policy agenda, a big say around our cabinet table and in all the decision-making forums of our government, and that's because Prime Minister Albanese deeply believes in our state, our people and its potential.
So you don't have aspirations to become a leader one day yourself?
No.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Treasurer, for your time today. That brings us to the conclusion of our lunch. Please join me in thanking the Treasurer.
Thanks, everyone. Once again want to acknowledge our naming rights partners, Virgin Australia Group, Brisbane Airport Corporation and Griffith University, as well as our other event partners. For more information on the Queensland Media Club's upcoming events, please sign up to the mailing list via the QR code. It should be on the back of your menu card at your table, and thanks again for coming today. Thank you.
Hey, Joe. Hey, Joe.
Yeah. Who wants to go first?